Everything you've been told about the Middle Ages in movies, books, or fairy tale imagery has been softened, rewritten, or simply made up. We've romanticized a time that was built not on honor and chivalry, but on disease, superstition, hunger, and silence. Kings weren't wise, knights weren't clean, peasants weren't jolly, and castles weren't grand. They were damp, dark, and dangerous. The truth is, most people in medieval Europe lived short, painful lives surrounded by death, dirt, and things they didn't understand. And what killed them most often wasn't what you'd expect, not war, not swords, not dragons, but the mundane, the invisible, the small. The things that lived in your clothing, the things that whispered inside your skull. The things you were told not to question. This isn't a story about glory, it's about what really happened and why you wouldn't have survived it. Lice were everywhere, not just in the hair, but in the seams of your tunic, the folds of your bedsheet, the damp edge of your collar. They lived in the fibers of wool cloaks and the straw you slept on. You didn't wash often, not because you were lazy, but because soap was rare, water was cold, privacy didn't exist, and time for bathing was a luxury no poor family could afford. Most peasants wore the same clothes for weeks, even months. You might shake them out in the morning, but that only spread the problem. Lice were simply part of life. They fed on your blood, laid eggs along your waistline, and came back faster than you could kill them. Everyone had them, and no one expected to be free of them. But what most people didn't realize was that lice didn't just bite, they carried death. Diseases like trench fever, typhus, and relapsing fever were transmitted through their feces, rubbed into broken skin during scratching. You might start with a headache, a few days of fever, maybe some muscle aches. You would keep working, you had to. There were no sick days, no one to care for you. But by the time the rash appeared, by the time your joints swelled and your breathing turned shallow, it was too late. In crowded homes where entire families shared a straw mattress, one person's lice quickly became everyone's problem. Death moved quietly through the house, one child coughing in the corner, a grandmother unable to rise, a man too weak to hold a shovel. Sometimes no one even realized it was the lice. They thought it was punishment from God, and when someone died, their blanket, still full of the insects that killed them, was often passed on to the next person. There were no clean shrouds. No sealed graves, just more bodies in the same bedding on the same floor, next to the same fire that never burned hot enough. You could die from something that never spoke, never screamed, never even left a mark big enough to notice. And you wouldn't be the first or the last. In the Middle Ages, it wasn't the sword that most often killed you. It was what you were already wearing. In the Middle Ages, your mind didn't belong to you. It belonged to the church. There was no such thing as mental illness. No words for anxiety, no understanding of schizophrenia, no distinction between grief and madness or epilepsy and evil. If you talked to yourself, if you cried for days without reason, if you stopped responding to your name, or worse, if you screamed in the night, shook on the ground, or said you heard voices, they didn't say you were sick. They said you were possessed. They believed your soul had been breached, that demons had entered you through sin, through dreams, through punishment from God. And once you were labeled as a vessel of the devil, you no longer had the right to be treated like a person. You were taken, sometimes by family, sometimes by neighbors, sometimes by priests. They would tie your hands behind your back, force you into a church basement, into a stone room, into a pit. You weren't asked if you were afraid. Because fear was part of the proof. The treatment was purification. That meant fasting, screaming, salt in the mouth, iron against the skin. You were bound to chairs, doused in freezing water, slapped across the face until you stopped speaking. And if that didn't work, they escalated, because if pain didn't drive the devil out, they believed it meant the devil liked where he was. Some were chained by the ankle to walls for years, their own filth pooled beneath them. They were beaten for muttering scripture incorrectly. They were burned with candle wax when they cried. They were left without light, without warmth, in rooms with no doors, only a slot for bread once a day, and sometimes not even that. Women were particularly vulnerable. If you were a widow who talked to yourself, you were a witch. If you bled at the wrong time, laughed at the wrong moment, stared too long at the crucifix, they whispered that Satan had made a nest inside you. And they acted accordingly. There are written records of exorcisms that ended with the person dying on the floor, bones broken, wrists split open by rope, body blackened by repeated blows. There were no trials, no defense. Only prayer, pain, and punishment. And worst of all, those who survived didn't leave. They were hidden, locked away in monasteries, buried alive in silence. Some were entombed behind walls, literally sealed in with bricks, still breathing, because it was cheaper than watching over them. No ceremony, no funeral, just a scream that no one ever admitted hearing. They didn't call it cruelty, they called it mercy. In a world where the church controlled your body, your land, your time, and your death, it was no surprise that they claimed your mind too. And when that mind didn't behave, they didn't try to heal it, they destroyed it. In the Middle Ages, the church taught that baptism wasn't just a ritual, it was the soul's ticket into heaven. It was protection, it was identity. And without it, you were nothing. So if your baby died before the priest arrived, before the words were spoken and the water touched the skin, before the sign of the cross was traced onto their tiny forehead, the church did not consider that child human. It had not been claimed by God, it had no name in the eyes of heaven, and therefore it had no place in holy ground. You could weep, you could scream, you could beg, but the answer was the same. You may not bury your baby in the cemetery. You may not mark their name in the parish record. You may not place them near the dead who belong to the church. They were denied a grave, denied a prayer, denied the right to exist. For mothers who had carried life for 9 months, who had bled into straw and screamed alone while labor tore their body open, this was worse than death. You held your child's body in your arms, still warm, and were told, "This one does not count." Some women buried their babies in secret, at the edge of the forest, in the shadows behind barns, under rocks by the stream. No marker, no priest. Just a patch of dirt and hands that shook too much to finish the job. Others hid the body in baskets, wrapped in cloth, left at the church doors not for help, but in hope that someone else would claim it, that maybe, somehow, a lie could save a soul. And some simply gave up. They left the child's body in the field where it had died, covered it in straw, walked away before anyone could ask questions, because they knew what would happen next: rumors, judgment, punishment. The church might accuse them of sin, of impurity, of bringing death through their unworthiness. A few places offered a compromise, limbo cemeteries outside the consecrated walls, but even there, the graves were unmarked. Even there, no bells were rung. The most horrifying part wasn't just the death, it was the silence that followed. There was no mourning because you weren't allowed to mourn. There was no name because your baby didn't belong to God. And when spring came and the earth softened again, all you could do was remember exactly where you had dug, because no one else would. When death came in the Middle Ages, it didn't always come quickly. Often it came slow, crawling. Days or even weeks of shallow breathing, rotting wounds, fevered sweat soaking into straw, and moans that turned to whimpers and then to silence. But the worst part wasn't the pain, it was the waiting, alone. Because when people realized you were dying, they stopped coming near you. The fear of contagion was stronger than compassion. If you were coughing blood, or shaking with fever, or vomiting into a corner, your family might pray for you from the other side of the door. A neighbor might leave food outside, but no one sat by your side, no one washed your face, no one held your hand. You could lie in bed for 3 days without a cup of water reaching your lips. Sometimes the room would be locked from the outside, not because they were cruel, at least not intentionally, but because they were terrified. One sick person could infect a household. One corpse left too long could bring in the devil. In some villages, people believed the breath of the dying could carry demons, so they sealed the room. They stuffed cloth under the door, and they waited, not for recovery, for stillness. The silence of someone dying was considered proof that the soul had finally surrendered. But often, that silence came from exhaustion, from screaming until your throat tore, from begging for water no one brought, from whispering prayers into the dark while your mind slipped into fevered fragments. Some people died calling names no one answered. Others died thinking they were already buried. Some died hallucinating fields and sunlight, but all of them died alone, unwashed, afraid, covered in their own waste. Cheeks hollowed, mouths open, eyes staring at a ceiling that never moved. And when they stopped breathing, no one rushed in. The door might stay shut for another day, or 2, just in case. Then if anyone still cared or was brave enough, they would wrap your body in old cloth, drag you out by the legs, and take you to a grave that had already been dug shallow. There were no final words, no candles, no farewells. Just dirt and the hope that the sickness stayed with you underground. In the end, your death was not remembered, because your dying had already been forgotten. In the Middle Ages, punishment wasn't about justice. It was about control, visible, lasting, irreversible control. It wasn't enough for the guilty to suffer. They had to be changed, marked, maimed, made into a warning. And for some crimes, real or imagined, the price was castration. It wasn't rare. It wasn't whispered about. In some kingdoms it was law, a sentence written and carried out in daylight with witnesses, for adultery, for rape. for theft in some places, for accusations of dishonoring a lord's daughter even without proof. In some towns, being a eunuch was seen not as a sign of guilt but of discipline, and once it was done, there was no appeal. No reversal, only silence. There were no doctors, no anesthetics, no preparation beyond tying your wrists behind your back or chaining your ankles to a bench. You were stripped, exposed, sometimes gagged, often not. The knife was not clean, the iron was not sharp. The men who carried it out were not surgeons. They were butchers, executioners, sometimes priests, and what they removed wasn't just flesh, it was manhood, identity, lineage, and power. You didn't bleed out immediately, that was the horror of it. You bled for hours, days. If you lived, and many didn't, the wound could fester, turn black, attract flies, become a slow infection that crawled through your body like something alive. There are accounts of men dying days later, feverish, delirious, crying out for death to finish what justice had begun. But for those who survived, survival wasn't mercy, it was memory. Every movement reminded you, sitting, walking, pissing. Your voice might change, your status certainly would. You were no longer a husband, never a father, never again a soldier or a craftsman in some trades. You became a thing watched, pitied, or mocked. Some were sent to monasteries where they were considered safer. Others were made servants, their mutilation a form of loyalty. Some were just turned out into the cold, left to wander a world that no longer saw them as men. What made it worse was how easy it was to get there. One accusation, one rumor, one wrong glance, one powerful man who didn't like the way you stood too close to his sister, and your body no longer belonged to you. And when it was over, there was no marker, no record, just pain and silence, because the church said it was lawful, and the law said it was righteous, and the crowd said nothing, they just watched. Torture wasn't a secret in the Middle Ages. It wasn't hidden behind prison doors or whispered about in shadowy halls. It was public, it was planned, and it was scheduled like a market, like a sermon, like a feast. When someone was accused of heresy, theft, treason, or even just crossing the wrong nobleman, the punishment didn't come quietly. It was prepared, the square was swept, a stage was built, the tools were arranged. Racks, whips, chains, hot irons, spiked chairs, and word spread quickly, not to mourn, not to protest, but to gather, because this was entertainment. Men, women, children came, they brought bread, they joked. They stood with friends and pointed, some brought stools to see better. This wasn't a horror to them, it was part of life, part of how order was kept, part of how the world reminded itself who was in control. And when the condemned was brought out, often naked, often bleeding already, there was no gasp, no hush, just the creak of rope, the hiss of iron, and the sound of a crowd settling in to watch. The torturer was not a monster. He was a craftsman hired by the city, paid by the church, licensed by the crown. His job was not to kill, not yet, it was to extract truth, confession, names, submission, and he took his time. Fingernails were torn out one by one. Flesh was peeled in strips, bones were broken carefully, methodically. Joints dislocated, then reset, then dislocated again. Tongues were pierced, eyes were threatened, feet were burned, and the crowd watched. They laughed when the screams became garbled. They leaned in when the body twitched. They nodded solemnly when the priest stepped forward to remind everyone that this was justice, that pain cleansed sin, that suffering was sacred. Children watched, mothers watched. Sometimes entire school groups were brought to see. And when it was done, if it ever was, the victim was either dragged back to the cell to die slowly, or paraded through the streets, broken and bleeding, a living symbol of obedience. If they confessed, they might be killed more quickly next time. If not, the torture continued the next day, and the day after, until their body gave out. Some were beheaded, some were hanged, some were flayed, some were burned. And some were simply left in cages, hung from the walls of castles, until birds plucked out their eyes and time did the rest. But long before they died, their pain had already served its purpose, not for truth, not for redemption, but for fear. Because the crowd didn't come to learn, they came to remember what happens when you speak too loudly, when you refuse, when you disobey, and they didn't scream, they applauded. In the Middle Ages, if you were a woman, your body stopped being yours the moment you got married. Not metaphorically, legally. Marriage was not a partnership, it was a contract of ownership, and what the husband owned above land and livestock was access to his wife's body, at any time, in any way, with or without her consent. Consent, in fact, wasn't even a recognized concept. The law did not protect you from your husband, because to the law, he was not capable of violating you. You were his, that was the point. The church reinforced it. The priest reminded brides during the marriage rite that they must submit to their husband's will. It was presented as sacred duty, as obedience, as a woman's holy purpose. Refusing was not defiance, it was sin. A wife who said no could be accused of withholding her role, of tempting her husband toward adultery, of endangering the family's honor. If he forced her and she complained, she was the one reprimanded. There are no records of marital rape trials in medieval Europe, not because it didn't happen, but because it wasn't considered a category of violence. It was considered marriage functioning as designed, even when bruises formed. Even when blood soaked the bedding, even when the wife cried, screamed, tried to run, it was discipline, a correction, a private matter. Husbands were advised by some religious texts to be gentle, yes, but firmness was also encouraged if the wife strays from obedience. And the worst part is you couldn't leave. Divorce didn't exist for commoners. Annulments were expensive and rare. If your husband beat you, raped you, treated you like a thing, you endured. If you ran, you were hunted. If you spoke out, you were laughed at, or worse, accused of being possessed, of adultery, of rebellion. There was no safe house, no law, no voice. Even childbirth didn't spare you. If your husband wanted sex a week after you bled out giving birth, it was his right. If you cried, he could say it was your nature. If you resisted, he could say it was your punishment. If the neighbors heard and said nothing, it wasn't cruelty, it was normal. And for some women, the worst suffering wasn't what was done to them, but that they began to believe it was deserved. They folded into silence, into ritual, into numbness, because the only thing worse than being used was being punished for remembering that it hurt. So no, marital rape wasn't a crime, it was a right, a duty. A silence woven so tightly into everyday life that even centuries later, we're still unlearning it. In the Middle Ages, if you lost your mind, you didn't go to a doctor, you didn't go to a healer. You didn't even go to a priest for comfort. You went nowhere because someone else decided what to do with you, and often that decision was permanent. Mental illness was seen not as sickness but as danger, a threat to order, to God. To the household, if you screamed in the night, walked naked through the village, laughed at nothing, refused to speak, harmed yourself, or simply became too unpredictable, you became a problem that needed to be contained. Not healed, contained. At first, families tied you up, left you in sheds, chained you to bedposts. Some tried prayer, others tried beatings. None of it worked, and so, in some places, monasteries, parishes, small villages with thick walls and no options, they turned to something else. They put you in a room, a stone room, no window, no furniture, just 4 walls and a dirt floor. They gave you bread and water maybe once a day through a slot in the wall, and then they bricked you in, literally, 1 stone at a time. Mortar laid slowly, until the door became a wall, until the light disappeared, until the sounds of the world faded behind limestone and fear. It wasn't always called a punishment. Sometimes it was done out of mercy, to keep you safe. To keep others safe, to keep God from being offended by your madness. Monks wrote about it in cold, sparse language. The girl was sealed in for the safety of the house. The demon quieted when the chamber was closed. You didn't die right away, that was the horror of it. You survived for weeks, even months, alone in the dark. Some were left with food rations, some weren't. Some were given a prayer book they couldn't read. Some scratched at the walls until their nails peeled off. Some sang. Others sobbed until their voice cracked and their breath turned shallow. And finally, inevitably, the silence came, not peace. Just the kind of silence that happens when the body gives up before the soul does. When they opened the wall years later, if they ever did, they found bones, bent, curled, sometimes clawed into the corners. The kind of skeleton that still looked like it had been afraid. There were no graves, no markers, no names, because once the bricks went up, you stopped existing. In the Middle Ages, fear traveled faster than truth. And fear, once spoken, could become a weapon sharp enough to destroy hundreds, not with blades, but with words. All it took was a whisper. One person saying they saw something strange. A woman in the woods, gathering herbs by moonlight. A child convulsing in bed with no explanation. A storm that ruined crops, followed by the suggestion that someone somewhere had brought it upon them. The idea didn't need proof. It didn't even need witnesses, just repetition. Just silence from those too afraid to question it. And just like that, an entire village could be marked. It began subtly. The priest might preach a sermon about hidden sin. The bailiff might remind the people of their duty to report suspicious behavior. Families might stop talking to their neighbors. Children were told to avoid certain homes. Bread wasn't shared. Eyes didn't meet. Then came the visit from church officials, from lords, enforcers, from armed men wearing the authority of law and sanctity. They didn't ask, they searched, they interrogated, they took notes and names. Once accused of witchcraft, heresy, or communing with unclean spirits, a person had no way to prove their innocence. You couldn't disprove something invisible. If you cried, they said the devil was resisting. If you stayed calm, they said the devil had steeled you. If you ran, you were guilty. If you stayed, you were hiding something. There was no exit, but the horror didn't end with one arrest, because fear is contagious. And in some cases, to root out evil, the authorities decided it wasn't enough to punish the accused. They punished the place. There are records, quiet, dry, official, of entire hamlets being cleansed, not metaphorically, burned, dismantled. Depopulated, a few families executed, others sent into exile, their land absorbed by the church or local lords. What's left in their wake? Nothing, just blank patches on old maps, a field where a village used to be. A well sealed with stone, a cemetery whose names no one speaks aloud anymore. Sometimes the rumor was that a healer was using dark charms, sometimes that Jews had poisoned the well, sometimes that a group of poor women met at night to dance. Each of these, small, unverifiable, meaningless in isolation, became justification for destruction. And the most terrifying thing, it often wasn't even hate that drove it. It was convenience. Fear made people easy to control. Erasing a village didn't just remove a threat, it served as a reminder: keep quiet, stay small, be forgettable, or they'll forget you on purpose. There were no memorials, no justice. No rebuilding, just smoke, soil, and silence where voices used to live. In the Middle Ages, even death had a class system. If you were wealthy, noble, or blessed by the church, death came with ceremony. There were candles and incense. Bell tolls, a procession, a coffin, a priest, a patch of consecrated ground where your name could be etched into stone and your body laid to rest with prayers for your soul's journey. But if you were poor, and most people were, none of that was guaranteed. Burial wasn't a rite, it was a transaction. You needed a shroud, you needed a coffin, or at least wood. You needed to pay the gravedigger. And most importantly, you needed permission to be buried on church land. That permission came with a price. No money, no grave, it was that simple. Families begged. Some sold tools, animals, or even the clothing off their own bodies just to buy a patch of dirt for their dead. Others carried their loved one wrapped in a blanket through the streets, hoping a priest would take pity. But pity had limits, and bureaucracy always won. And when there was nothing left to trade, nowhere to bury, no one to listen, the body was discarded, sometimes behind a barn, sometimes deep in the woods, but most often into the village well. It was out of the way, deep, cold, forgotten, and what flowed into that well still fed the village. There are documented cases, from rural England to central France, of bones discovered centuries later at the bottoms of communal wells. Bodies twisted between stones, skulls fractured, remains bundled in rotted cloth. Dozens of them, sometimes mothers with infants, sometimes the elderly, sometimes plague victims, or simply the poor, anonymous, silent, abandoned. These weren't crimes of hate, they were crimes of convenience. You died quietly. You were dragged by night, you were lowered without words, you disappeared in the dark, and life went on above you, the same villagers drinking from the same water, pretending they didn't know. No gravestone, no name, no memory. Just the sound of a bucket dropping into a dark hole where the forgotten stay forever.